The air on November 3rd, 1878, carried the brittle scent of imminent frost and the metallic tang of fear. In the small, isolated settlement of Providence, nestled in a fold of the unforgiving Dakota plains, winter was not a season, but a predator. It stalked the perimeter of their collective existence, and survival was measured in cords of seasoned oak and the thickness of one's cabin walls. For Alara, it was measured in the hollow echo of her late husband's axe, now silent for a year, and the condescending pity in the eyes of the town elders. She was 19 years old. She stood before them in the starkly functional town hall, a building that smelled of pine resin, damp wool, and self-importance. The council, Elder Silas Blackwood, Thomas Miller, and Jebediah Croft, sat behind a long trestle table, their faces etched with the gravity of their task. The final allocation of the communal winter woodpile. It was the settlement's most critical resource, a bulwark against the white death that would soon descend from the north. Ilara's portion, a scant quarter cord of poplar and birch, lay pitifully beside the stacks designated for families with able-bodied men. It was a portion for one person, calculated without compassion, a mathematical decree of suffering. It was not enough to survive until January, let alone April. "It is what the charter dictates, Ilara," Elder Silas stated, his voice a low rumble of practiced authority. He did not look at her, instead focusing on a ledger before him, his fingers tracing lines of ink as if they were holy scripture. "A household of one receives a single share. Your husband, may he rest in peace, would have provided for more." The implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Her widowhood was a failure of foresight, her vulnerability a personal failing. Thomas Miller, a man whose prosperity was as round as his belly, shifted in his chair. "It's the proper way. We all must abide by the rules. To give you more would be to take from another family, from children." He gestured vaguely toward the door, as if invoking the specter of shivering infants to sanctify his parsimony. Not one of them had faced a winter alone. Not one of them had buried a husband taken by pneumonia the previous spring. And not one of them was willing to see the young woman before them as anything other than a problem to be dispensed with according to established procedure. Ilara's hands, calloused from a summer of tending her small garden and mending her own roof, were clenched at her sides. She had anticipated this. She had spent sleepless nights listening to the wind, rehearsing the words she now had to speak. "I do not ask for a larger share of wood, Elder Blackwood," she said, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the stale air. "I ask for something else. I ask for permission to dig on my property and for access to the community clay pit for 3 days." Jebediah Croft, a wiry man with suspicious eyes, finally spoke, his tone sharp with incredulity. "Dig? In this ground? The frost is but an inch from the surface. What foolishness are you planning?" "I am planning to build a winter hearth," Ilara explained, her gaze unwavering. "A thermal bench. It is a design my grandmother taught me, from the old country. It uses a fraction of the wood of an iron stove and holds the heat for a full day." She paused, choosing her words with the care of a mason laying foundation stones. "It requires a trench to be dug through my cabin floor, a firebox made of clay and stone, and a long flue that warms a mass of earth and cobble before it exits the house." A thick, disbelieving silence descended upon the room. Elder Silas finally looked up from his ledger, his eyebrows forming a single, disapproving line across his forehead. He looked at Thomas, then at Jebediah. A smirk played on Thomas Miller's lips. "A trench? In your cabin?" he scoffed. "You mean to bury your fire? Hide your wood in a ditch?" The men chuckled, a dry, grating sound. The tension in the room broke, replaced by the easy camaraderie of shared ridicule. "The girl has been touched by grief," Jebediah said, shaking his head with an air of profound wisdom. "Her mind is wandering. We should be praying for her, not entertaining these fantasies. It is not a fantasy, Alara insisted, her voice rising slightly with the frustration of explaining color to a blind man. It is a principle of thermodynamics. A quick, hot fire heats a large thermal mass, the earth and clay floor, which then radiates warmth for many hours. An iron stove heats the air, which leaks out of every crack in the cabin. My design heats the house itself. The smoke that leaves the chimney will be cool to the touch, its heat given to my home, not to the sky. Her use of scientific terms only deepened their suspicion. It was unseemly, this knowledge in a young woman. It was unnatural. Elder Silas held up a hand, silencing the murmurs. Alara, we appreciate your ingenuity, but we cannot sanction such a dangerous and frankly bizarre experiment. What if you set your cabin ablaze? What if you fill it with smoke and suffocate in your sleep? We are responsible for the welfare of this community. My cabin is my own, she countered, her chin held high. The risk is my own. I am not asking for your help, only for your permission to try. Give my share of the wood to the Miller family or the Crofts. I will not need it. I need clay and the right to work on my own land. This was a masterstroke of strategy. By refusing the wood, she absolved them of their meager responsibility. Her failure, which they saw as an absolute certainty, would be entirely her own. They could wash their hands of her fate while appearing magnanimous. Silas exchanged another look with his councilman. They nodded. The decision was made. Very well, Silas declared, his tone dripping with condescension. You may have your clay. You may dig your ditch. But when this folly fails, and you come to us shivering in the December winds, do not expect the community's reserves to be open to you. The wood has been allocated. This is your choice, and yours alone. He closed the ledger with a definitive thud. The audience was over. As Alara walked out of the town hall, the quarter cord of wood meant for her was already being hauled toward Thomas Miller's already generous woodpile. She did not look back. The first flakes of snow, tiny and sharp as needles, were beginning to fall. She had no time to waste. The predator was stirring, and she had a fortress to build. The work began the next morning, on November 4th. The ground was as unforgiving as the council's pronouncements. The topsoil was a thin veneer over a dense, clay-rich substrate that was already stiffening with the encroaching frost. Her tools were few and well-worn, a spade with a cracked handle, a heavy pickaxe that had belonged to her husband, Daniel, and a wheelbarrow with a squeaking, lopsided wheel. Her cabin was a simple affair, 16 feet by 20 feet, with a packed earth floor. It was this floor that she would transform into the heart of her home. She started in the center, marking out the path of the trench with a line of ash. It would not be a straight line. To maximize the surface area for heat exchange, the flue had to be long and winding. She planned a serpentine path, a gentle back and forth that would cover a 12-foot by 8-foot section of the floor. This would become the warm bench, the core of her living space. The total length of the underground channel would be nearly 35 feet. Each swing of the pickaxe was a jarring shock that traveled up her arms and into her shoulders. The ground yielded reluctantly, in stony, frozen clumps. The first day, she managed to break the surface along the entire 35-foot path, a shallow scar in the earth, no more than 4 inches deep. Her palms were raw, her back a knot of burning muscle. That evening, as the men of Providence sat by their fires, they could hear the rhythmic, lonely chink of her pickaxe striking the stubborn earth. She's digging her own grave, Jebediah Croft was heard to remark at the general store, to nods of agreement. The next 3 days were spent at the clay pit, a communal resource a half-mile from the settlement. The clay there was of superior quality, a deep ochre color, plastic and heavy. She worked from dawn until dusk, digging out the raw clay, loading it into the wheelbarrow, and making the arduous journey back to her cabin. The wheelbarrow, laden with over 100 pounds of wet clay on each trip, protested with a continuous, high-pitched squeal. It was a sound that announced her every move to the watchful, critical eyes of the community. She ignored their stares, their whispered comments. She made 27 trips in total, piling the raw material near her cabin until a small mountain of reddish-brown earth stood as a testament to her resolve. With the clay secured, her focus returned to the excavation inside her cabin. The work was slow and methodical. She would break the hard earth with the pickaxe, then shovel the loosened dirt and rock into buckets, carrying them outside to a growing pile that would later be used for insulation. She dug down, inch by painful inch. The planned depth was 24 inches, the width 18. These measurements were precise, learned from her grandmother's detailed descriptions. The dimensions had to be exact to ensure the proper flow of air and heat, a principle known as draft. A channel too wide or too shallow would fail to draw the hot gases from the firebox with sufficient velocity. By the end of the second week, she had a trench. It snaked through the heart of her small home, a raw wound in the earth. The cabin was cold, colder than the air outside, as the newly exposed earth released its chill. She worked by the light of a single kerosene lamp, her breath pluming in the frigid air. During this time, Thomas Miller's wife Mary came by under the pretense of borrowing a cup of flour. She peered into the dim interior of the cabin, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and pity. "Ilara, child, what is this?" she asked, gesturing at the chaotic scene of dirt piles and the gaping trench. "Silas says you're trying to build a new kind of stove, but this is just a hole in the ground. You will freeze in here. Come and stay with us. Thomas won't mind, for a night or two." "Thank you for your kindness, Mary," Ilara replied, not unkindly, as she paused from leveling the bottom of the trench. "But I must finish my work. The warmth will come. It is all part of the design." Mary left, shaking her head, convinced the poor girl was truly lost. The offer was never repeated. The next phase of construction was the heart of the system, the firebox and the heat riser. This was the engine that would drive the entire apparatus. It was a design often referred to as a J-tube for its shape. The short, angled arm of the J would be the feed tube, where wood was loaded vertically. The long, vertical arm would be the combustion chamber, or heat riser. Ilara began by building a solid foundation of flat stones at one end of the trench. Upon this, she meticulously laid salvaged bricks she had scrounged from a collapsed chimney at the edge of the settlement. She had spent a full day chipping away the old, crumbling mortar, cleaning each brick for its new purpose. She mortared them together with a mixture of clay, sand, and fine straw, her hands shaping the thick, sticky substance. The feed tube was angled at 45 degrees. The heat riser stood perfectly vertical, rising 3 feet from the base of the trench. The key to the design's efficiency was insulation around the heat riser. This insulation would keep the temperature inside the riser incredibly high, up to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This extreme heat ensured the complete combustion of the wood, and crucially, the wood gases, releasing an enormous amount of energy from a small amount of fuel and producing almost no smoke or creosote. For the insulation, she used a mixture of clay and perlite, a volcanic glass she had found in a rock outcropping miles away, a secret spot her grandmother had shown her. She had spent 2 days pulverizing the rock into small, lightweight pebbles. She packed this insulating mixture into a cavity she created by building a second outer wall around the heat riser, leaving a 2-inch gap. This was the most technical part of the build, a process requiring patience and precision. any flaw could compromise the entire system. Once the J-tube was complete, she turned her attention to the flue pipes that would carry the superheated gases through the trench. She could not afford metal ducting, which would have cost upwards of $15, more than half of the $47 in silver coins she had to her name. Instead, she would make her own pipes from the clay she had hauled. She built cylindrical forms from rolled-up lengths of bark and began packing her clay mixture around them. Each section was 2 feet long with an 8-inch diameter. She fashioned bell and spigot ends so they would fit snugly together. It was laborious, repetitive work. She made 18 sections in total. Baking them was the next challenge. She built a temporary kiln outside her cabin, a simple beehive-shaped structure of mud and straw over a stone base. She carefully stacked the green clay pipes inside, then fed a slow, steady fire for 2 full days to cure them, gradually increasing the heat until the clay was fired into hard, durable ceramic. The process consumed a significant amount of scrap wood she had collected over the summer, wood the others had deemed unsuitable for their stoves. To them, it was trash. To her, it was the means of creation. The community watched the smoke from her kiln with amusement. "She's burning her wood before her stove is even built," was the prevailing joke. On November 24th, with the threat of a major snowstorm looming in the bruised purple clouds on the horizon, she began to lay the flue. She carefully placed the ceramic pipes into the bottom of the serpentine trench, fitting the sections together, sealing each joint with a thick collar of clay mortar. From the base of the heat riser, the flue snaked back and forth, a subterranean artery designed to give up its thermal energy to the surrounding earth. The final section of pipe turned upward at the far end of the trench, exiting through a small, stone-lined hole she had made in the cabin's foundation wall. This would be connected to a short, vertical chimney stack outside. The moment of truth for the system's core principle, the draft, had arrived. Before burying the pipes, she had to test it. With a trembling hand, she crumpled a piece of newspaper, lit it, and held it at the opening of the feed tube. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. A wisp of smoke curled back into the cabin. Her stomach tightened. Had she miscalculated? Was the flue too long? The bends too restrictive? Then she felt it. A faint but definite pull. The flame of the newspaper bent inward, and the smoke was suddenly sucked down into the J-tube and through the unseen 35-foot channel. A thin plume of smoke emerged from the chimney outlet outside. It worked. The powerful thermosiphon effect, driven by the intense heat that would be generated in the riser, had created a self-drawing chimney. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Now came the final, most physically demanding stage, creating the thermal mass. She began by backfilling the trench around the flue pipes with sand and small stones, tamping it down firmly to ensure good thermal contact. Then, she prepared the cob. She mixed the rest of her clay with sand and straw, adding water and kneading the mixture with her bare feet, stomping and turning it in a large wooden trough. It was exhausting, messy work that left her caked in mud from head to toe. She applied the cob in layers over the entire area of the trench, building it up until it was level with the rest of the cabin floor. She sculpted it into a smooth, comfortable bench, 16 inches high, that followed the serpentine path of the flue beneath. This bench would be the warmest spot in the house, a place to sit, to sleep, to dry clothes. She then laid a final 4-inch thick layer of smooth, hard-troweled cob over the entire floor of the cabin, sealing the system beneath a seamless, monolithic slab. The final component was a 55-gallon metal barrel, which she had purchased for $2.75. She placed this over the heat riser, converting it into a large, highly effective radiator for immediate convective heat while the mass of the floor was slowly charging. On December 10th, the project was complete. The interior of her cabin was transformed. The ugly, gaping trench was gone, replaced by a beautiful, sculptural earthen bench and a clean, smooth floor. It looked simple, almost primitive. To the casual observer, it was just a strange, lumpy piece of furniture and a new mud floor. Elder Silas paid her one final visit before the first major storm was forecast to hit. He stood in the doorway, not deigning to step inside. "So, this is the grand invention," he said, his eyes scanning the space with a look of profound disappointment. He pointed a stern finger at the J-tube opening. "And you intend to put fire in that hole?" "I do," Alara said simply. "The smoke will fill this cabin in minutes." "You will be lucky if you do not suffocate," he pronounced with the finality of a judge passing sentence. "I have done my duty and warned you. When you are choking on your own foolishness, remember that you were warned." He turned and left without another word. That evening, Alara lit the first fire. She fed small, dry branches into the feed tube. They caught immediately, and the draft took hold with a satisfying low roar, like a sleeping dragon drawing its first breath. There was no smoke in the cabin. None. The powerful draw pulled every wisp down into the combustion chamber. Within minutes, the metal barrel began to radiate a powerful, welcoming heat, quickly taking the chill off the air. She placed her hand on the cob bench near the firebox. It was still cold. She knew it would take time. For the next 3 hours, she fed the fire, using no more wood than would have been consumed in 20 minutes by a conventional stove. The fire burned with a clean, intense, jet-like flame inside the riser, visible through a small viewing port she had fashioned from a piece of scavenged mica. Then, she let the fire die out. The barrel cooled within the hour, but the bench was beginning to warm. A slow, deep, penetrating warmth was rising from the earth beneath her feet. She lay down on its smooth, curved surface. It was like lying on a sun-baked rock at the end of a long summer day. The heat was gentle, constant. Throughout the night, as the wind began to howl outside and the first sheets of snow scoured the plains, the bench and the floor continued to release their stored energy. The temperature inside her cabin did not drop below 65 degrees. She slept soundly for the first time in weeks, cocooned in the silent, radiant warmth of her own creation. The storm that began on December 18th, 1876, was not a storm. It was a meteorological siege. It would later be known as the Great White Hurricane, a blizzard of historic, terrifying proportions. For 3 days, the world dissolved into a churning vortex of wind and snow. The temperature plummeted to 30, then 40 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, with a wind chill that defied measurement and sanity. Visibility was reduced to the length of a man's arm. The sun vanished. Time itself seemed to freeze. For the people of Providence, it was a battle for survival fought inside their own homes. Their cabins, built of sturdy oak logs, were nevertheless vulnerable. The fierce, penetrating wind found every chink, every uncaulked seam, sucking the precious heat out into the maelstrom. Their iron stoves, which had been sources of comfort and pride, became ravenous, insatiable beasts. They blazed through seasoned oak logs with terrifying speed, demanding to be fed every hour, day and night. The air they heated rose immediately to the ceiling, leaving the floors frigid, while the walls leached warmth to the screaming wind outside. On the second day, the woodpiles began to shrink at an alarming rate. Families huddled together under every blanket they owned, moving closer and closer to the stoves that were failing to keep the deadly cold at bay. The windows were opaque sheets of thick, feathery frost. The world outside was an undifferentiated roar. Panic, cold and sharp as an icicle, began to set in. Jebediah Croft, his cabin at the western edge of the settlement, burned through his entire winter allocation in 48 hours. His walls were radiating cold, and the frost was now creeping across the floor. Inside Alara's cabin, a different reality prevailed. Each morning, she would spend 2 hours feeding her mass heater. She used the poplar and birch that the council had deemed inferior, along with deadfall and thick branches. The stove consumed it efficiently, roaring to life and pouring thermal energy into the earthen mass beneath her floor. For the other 22 hours of the day, there was no fire. There was only a profound, silent, and steady warmth. The floor and the bench were a massive, gentle radiator, maintaining the ambient temperature at a comfortable 68 degrees. There were no cold spots. The air was fresh, as her system drew its combustion air from a small, dedicated vent, rather than from the cabin's interior. She had ample food and water. She sat on her warm bench, mending a shirt, listening to the storm rage against her sanctuary, a sound that was muffled and distant. She was an island of calm in an ocean of chaos. On the third day, the wind reached a crescendo, a physical force that made the stoutest cabins groan in protest. It was late in the afternoon when the frantic, desperate pounding began at her door. It was a sound almost lost in the gale, but she heard it. She unbarred the door, and a figure, caked in snow and ice, stumbled inside, falling to his knees. It was Thomas Miller. His face was a mask of frostbite, his beard a solid chunk of ice. He stared at her, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief, not at her, but at the feeling of the air. "Warm," he stammered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "It's warm." He looked around the small, calm space, his gaze falling on the simple clay bench. He crawled toward it, drawn by an instinct for survival, and collapsed onto its surface, pressing his frozen hands and face against the life-giving heat. "How?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "Our fire went out hours ago. The wood is gone. Mary, the children, they're so cold." Alara said nothing. She closed and barred the door against the storm, then went to her cupboard and began to prepare a hot broth. She helped Thomas remove his frozen outer garments and wrapped him in a thick wool blanket. "Bring them here," she said quietly. "Follow the rope I strung to the well. It will guide you." Thomas, humbled and broken, nodded. He drank the broth she gave him, the warmth spreading through his shivering body. He looked at the floor, at the bench, at the strange-looking firebox in the corner, and his face was a portrait of utter incomprehension. The ditch he had mocked, the buried fire he had ridiculed, was radiating a heat more profound and enduring than anything he had ever known. He gathered his strength and, using her guide rope as his lifeline in the whiteout, ventured back into the storm. Within the hour, he returned, half carrying his wife Mary and their 2 small children. They were wrapped in every blanket they owned, their faces pale and bluish with cold. When they entered the cabin, their reaction was the same as Thomas's: stunned, silent disbelief at the wall of warmth that enveloped them. The youngest child, a boy of 4, began to cry, not from pain, but from the simple, overwhelming relief of feeling warm for the first time in what must have seemed like an eternity. Mary Miller looked at Alara, her eyes swimming with tears of gratitude and shame. "We were wrong," she whispered. "We were such fools." They were not the last. Before night fell, another knock came. It was Jebediah Croft and his family, their situation just as dire. They too were taken in without a word of reproach. The small cabin was now crowded, but the air remained warm and fresh. Her harshest critics were now her wards, huddled together on the earthen bench that was the physical manifestation of her supposed folly. The final arrival came near midnight. A party of 2 men, guided by the light in Alara's window, the only light visible in the entire settlement, brought Elder Silas Blackwood and his wife, Eleanor. The elder was suffering from severe exposure, his usual authoritative demeanor stripped away, leaving only a frail, shivering old man. He had resisted leaving his home until the very last, his pride a poor shield against the killing cold. As they helped him into the cabin, his eyes, clouded with pain and confusion, struggled to make sense of the scene. His congregation, his councilmen, his family, all saved, all gathered in the one place he had condemned. He was laid gently on the warm floor, and as the heat began to seep into his frozen limbs, he looked at Alara, who was tending to one of the Croft children, and he finally understood. He had worshipped the letter of the law, while she had honored the unwritten laws of the earth itself. When the blizzard finally broke on the 4th morning, the silence it left behind was as profound as the storm's fury. The world was a landscape of impossible, sculptural white, beautiful and deadly. The sun shone on a settlement that had been fundamentally broken. The cost of the storm, and of their arrogance, became terrifyingly clear in the days that followed. 4 families, living on the outskirts of the settlement, had not survived. They were found frozen in their homes, their wood piles exhausted, their iron stoves cold monuments to the failure of convention. 12 people, including 5 children, were dead. The survivors gathered in the center of the snow-clogged town, their faces gaunt with grief and shock. It was there that Elder Silas Blackwood, his voice raspy and weak, stood before Alara and the rest of the community. He did not try to excuse his actions. He did not try to soften the blow of his failure. "I stood in judgment of this woman," he began, his gaze fixed on Alara. "I mocked her wisdom. I trusted in our established ways and our written rules, and I dismissed knowledge that was older and deeper. My pride, our collective pride, has cost this community more than we can bear. We called her plan foolishness. We called her work a ditch. But that ditch was our ark. Her wisdom was our salvation. The lives we have lost, they were not taken by the storm. They were lost because I, their leader, refused to listen." He bowed his head, a gesture of profound and utter submission. "Alara, I ask for your forgiveness, and I ask you, teach us." There was no vindictive triumph in Alara's heart, only a deep, somber sense of loss for the lives that could have been saved. Her victory was ashes in her mouth. She looked at the faces before her, the Millers, the Crofts, the Blackwoods, and saw not the skeptics who had scorned her, but the neighbors she would have to help rebuild. In the spring of 1877, as the great snows melted to reveal the wounded but resilient land, a new sound echoed through Providence. It was not the ring of axes splitting wood for the coming winter, but the rhythmic thud of pickaxes on earth and the squelch of bare feet mixing cob. Under Alara's quiet and patient direction, the men of the settlement, including Silas, Thomas, and Jebediah, began digging trenches in their own cabins. They learned to build the J-tubes, to insulate the heat risers, to fire the clay pipes, and to sculpt the great, warm benches of earth that would forever change their relationship with the prairie winter. Alara, the outcast widow, had become Alara, the sage. She had not sought power or prestige, only survival. But in saving herself, she had saved them all from their most dangerous enemy. Not the cold, but the stubborn refusal to believe that a better way was possible, buried just beneath their feet.